Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to the Palace session on evidence on gender equality and women empowerment in agriculture and food systems in low and middle income countries of day one of What for Global Summit 2022. This panel will present findings from three systematic reviews which were commissioned by a consultative group of agricultural research, the Gender Platform, on interventions leading to and improving women empowerment in agricultural and food systems. I'm Ashrita Saran. I'm the senior advisor with Campbell South Asia. I was also the former director with Campbell South Asia and have been affiliated with Campbell Collaboration since 2016, working on various methods development on evidence and gap map with Campbell Collaboration, and have led and co-authored several systematic reviews in evidence and gap maps. Joining me today in the panel are Dr. Sabina Singh and Suchi Malhotra. Dr. Sabina Singh is a director of research at Campbell South Asia and holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She's an information professional, social anthropologist, and a public health scholar with publication in peer-reviewed journal and edited books. Her gender and women empowerment. Suchi Kapoor is an evidence synthesis specialist with Campbell South Asia. She has more than 10 years of working experience in evidence synthesis, monitoring and evaluation, project and grant management, training and capacity building. Her core research interest area are child and women well-being, disaster, and gender and women empowerment. Some housekeeping rules that each of the presenters will get 15 minutes to present, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Requesting all the participants to keep posting their questions in the live Q&A section. We will try and take at least one or two questions towards the end of each presentation, but we would prefer that all the questions that have not been answered, we will be taking it towards the end of all of the presentations as well. So without wasting any more time, I would like to start with the first presentation, which is again funded by a consultative group of agricultural research, the Gender Platform. This systematic review is on interventions for promoting resilience through climate smart agriculture, practices for women farmers. The primary objective of this review was to synthesize evidence on the effectiveness of interventions to promote climate-smart agriculture, to enhance agricultural outcomes and resilience of women farmers in low and middle-income countries. These are the co-authors for this review. Now, land use, land cover changes, and climatic changes, they are all interrelated. Now, land use from crop and livestock cultivation and the use of pesticide and transportation of agricultural goods and services, and land cover changes from deforestation, they contribute to about more than 24% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Now, these greenhouse gas emissions impact and contribute to the climatic changes. Whereas the climatic changes that impact variations in temperature, increased in floods and rainfall, they negatively impact the agricultural production through land and soil degradation, as well as changing in the patterns and development of disease and vector-related information for the livestock that again negatively impact the agricultural production and livestock production altogether. Now, climatic changes impact agriculture in a number of ways. One way would be unpredictable farming conditions that lead to reduced crop production, loss of security. They also lead to the loss of fertile and coastal land, mainly caused by rising sea levels that lead to changes in quantities of fish and seafoods. They also lead to reduction in the grain quantity and quality available to the livestock, making them vulnerable to diseases and reducing their fertility and milk and meat production altogether. Now, developing countries, they are particularly vulnerable to climatic changes because of their geographical and climatic condition due to their geography in the tropical and the coastal regions. And also that because statistics shows that 65% of the workforce and 60% of these workforces in South Asia, they work in the agricultural sectors and hence solely depends on agriculture for their income, livelihood, food and nutrition securities. Women are even more vulnerable to climatic changes because women comprise of 43% of the agricultural labor forces in developing countries. And in addition, they face several constraints such as lack of land ownerships, limited access to range of services and inputs such as fertilizers and improved seed varieties. And access to agricultural extension services, sources, and access to agricultural education regarding climate smart practices and other innovations. Also, women's coping mechanism and resilience pattern to climatic stressors, it varies and have a complex interplay of ethnicity, religion, class, and burden of household, as well as age hierarchies within the house. As a result of which, climate smart agriculture emerges as a promising approach in terms of reducing agricultural related food insecurity, because climate smart agricultural practices, they provide approaches that help improve the agricultural outputs without depleting the natural resources altogether. And Food and Agricultural Organization, they define climate smart agriculture as agriculture that sustainably increases productivity, enhances the resilience, reduces greenhouse gas emission, and enhances the achievement of national food security and developmental goals. It is important to understand for the adoption of climate smart agricultural approaches by farmers, they also need to have an understanding and see an advantage in using climate smart agricultural approaches altogether. Hence, the first step in promoting and encouraging the use of climate smart agriculture approaches by farmers would be to increase their awareness around climate smart agricultural approaches and their effectiveness through strategies like knowledge dissemination approaches, such as farmer field schools and its modification. The financial bottlenecks that again lead to a barrier in adopting climate smart agricultural approaches can be dealt by subsidies, providing microfinances, and also crop insurances can mitigate the risk of climate change as well. Institutional arrangements such as building dams for irrigation can again help combat some of the barriers in adopting climate smart agricultural practices. Now, as we discussed, that women are more vulnerable in terms of access as well as using climate smart agricultural approaches. So, involving women into decision-making role in farming communities could be one of the ways in terms of improving access of women to these CSA approaches altogether. Now, these interventions can lead to increased knowledge and awareness of climate smart agricultural practices altogether, which thereby can lead to the increase in uptake of climate smart agricultural practices, such as use of botanical pesticides or use of increased seed varieties or climate resilient seed varieties, and also lead to disadoption of harmful practices such as overuse of pesticides. It can subsequently lead to changes in economic, social, and environmental outcomes, such as agricultural heat, decision making, and control of resources. In all, over the long term outcome, increasing resilience of women and gender inclusion into farming practices. In terms of scope, this was based on women and men who were engaged in agricultural and natural resource management and LMICs. Intervention included what I discussed in the earlier slides. Some of the key outcomes that we looked at were the increase in knowledge gain and CSA practices, adoption of favored practices, disadoption of harmful practices, and time use and drudgery by women. We included randomized controlled trial and quasi-experimental studies in our review. For this review, we did not include qualitative studies. That was out beyond the scope of this review. In terms of our findings, we included impact evaluation that were published in English, and the search was done from January 2000 to February 2022. We searched for close to 13 academic databases, including CAB Abstract, Greenfile, and Agricola. We identified close to 19,000 studies, of which 317 articles were assessed for full text. And of these, 8 impact evaluations were finally included in our review based on our inclusion criteria. In terms of the geographical spread, though it was a limited number, there were 3 studies that were identified from India, 2 were from Tanzania, and rest of the countries had each 1 study each that included Bangladesh, China, Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda. We also assessed the risk of bias of included studies, and overall there was a high risk of bias within the sample of included studies, with only 2 studies were found to be of low risk of bias, and 6 reported a high risk of bias. The main reason for high risk of bias among this population was the selection bias and the reporting bias, which was due to incomplete outcome reporting. In terms of the spread of studies across the intervention categories, all the studies reported intervention on knowledge dissemination and capacity building approaches. We did not find studies that were specific looking at financial approaches, or we're looking at institutional arrangements such as building dams for irrigation. Of these, no, of these studies, 4 studies reported on farmer field schools or its modification. 2 studies reported on group and individual training and demonstration to increase the use of botanical pesticides and also adopt the use of stress and climate variant varieties of seeds. Information and communication technologies was used in 2 of the studies, and it also indicated that, you know, when farmers they are more aware about the climatic risk and mitigation strategies, they are more likely to adopt those practices. And participatory action research was discussed in only 1 study among the sample population. In terms of the outcome, 4 included studies reported improvement in knowledge and awareness about CSA practices such as integrated pest management and the use of climate resilient and stress tolerant rice varieties. Adoption of CSA practices has been investigated in 3 studies, mainly around use of botanical pesticides and adoption of climate resilient stress varieties. 2 studies also reported disadoption of harmful practices such as overuse of insecticides and pesticides. We also included these studies for meta-analysis. So out of a sample of 8 included impact evaluations, 6 studies had adequate information for us to calculate the effect sizes, and these were included into the meta-analysis, of which 4 studies reported a moderate effect and a significant improvement in knowledge of smallholder farmers on CSA practices, which was measured by change in knowledge scores. In terms of the adoption and disadoption, 3 studies reported a small effect and a significant improvement in the adoption of CSA practices by smallholder farmers. In terms of disadoption, 2 studies reported a small and significant effect on reducing harmful practices. In terms of the other outcomes such as time use, attitude, decision making, and yield, we did not find a significant effect. It was found to be insignificant of all of these studies, and there was only single studies reporting these outcomes on the effect. Overall, there was a consensus on the direction of the effect. However, studies presented with considerable heterogeneity in the size of the effect, which was very high for adoption and disadoption outcome altogether. Overall, we can say that the review's findings showed promising evidence, though with limited number of studies, on the effectiveness of targeted intervention, promoting climate-smart agriculture and improving farmers' knowledge about CSA practices, adoption of better CSA practices, and disadoption of harmful and conventional practices. In terms of the gaps in evidence, we found that the studies were concentrated only in a few countries, and there were no studies from Europe, Central Asia, or Middle East, or North African region. Even from South Asia and Africa, the studies were only concentrated in a few countries. No studies reported impact on ownership and control of assets on women, decision-making power, or on risk mitigation strategies, perception of resilience to shock, and food security and nutrition. There were also lack of studies reporting impact on agricultural yield and time use. There were several categories of possible intervention which were not studied in the current evidence base that importantly included institutional arrangements such as farmer cooperative, impact of community infrastructure and contract farming, and also impact on financial approaches, for example, credit and subsidies and microfinance. There were also lack of studies on looking at the gender transformative approaches such as gender responsive budgeting and involvement of women in community-based natural resource management. There was lack of evidence on equity aspects such as land ownership, socioeconomic characteristics, ethnicity, as well as a discussion around socioeconomic and indigenous group. In terms of implication, despite the methodological and programmatic limitation that we found in our lot, the all reported studies noted a positive impact of intervention on promoting climate smart agriculture, in improving the knowledge of farmers, attitude, and helping smallholder farmers to adopt better practices. It is important that the research evaluating programs explicitly targeting women farmers with a focus on power liberation and equity is needed. Also, gender transformative approaches are also needed within the policy and legal framework that could be evaluated and hence could be used into the evidence synthesis. Implication for research, we definitely need more robust and methodologically sound evidence, as most of our studies in our review were found to be of high risk of bias. Use of theory-based impact evaluation that can explore outcomes and assumptions along the causal chain and assess the impact for different subgroup is needed. For our studies, the subgroup analysis did not reveal it did not reveal significant impact, and we were not able to assess there was high variability between the studies, even between the different subgroups. There's also a need for evidence reporting on a broader range of interventions, such as institutional arrangement, role of farmer cooperatives, and federations. And we definitely need more studies on behavioral intervention, changing the norms and values between males and female farmers. In terms of implication for women farmers, it is important to, if we want to promote the CSA practices for a sustainable agriculture development, it is also essential to integrate proactive gender perspective into the research strategies and to increase women participation in farmer research group to access the information and knowledge and have a voice in terms of constraining the cultural norms and tradition across adoption of CSA practices. With that, I would like to thank you, and I look forward to if you have any questions now. Otherwise, we'll take the question towards the end of the panel session. I see that we do not have any questions now, so I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Sabina Singh. Over to you.
Thank you, Ashrita. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening as per your time zones. So I will be presenting the findings of a systematic review on gender transformative approaches in agriculture for women's empowerment. So Ashrita has already made my job a little easier because she's already set the context for this presentation. So, but before that, I would like to acknowledge the support and the funding of our funders, which are CGIR Gender Impact Platform. And these are the team members, in addition to me: Kevin, Hikari, Heather, Hugh Sharma, Waddington, Ashrita, Neha, Ranjita, Avni, Linda, Stephen, Ranjana Rao, Sujata, Eduardo Masick, and Howard White. So we had our advisory board members as Emily Hellenbrand and Marlene Elias, and Anastasia Koryakina from Epi Reviewer software. She was a support person for this systematic review. So just to give you a broad overview of the presentations, I'll first talk very briefly about the background of this systematic review, taking you through the PICOs, the theory of change. Very briefly, I'll touch upon the methods, and we will elaborate on some of the findings of the systematic review. So as I was saying, so Ashrita has set the context for this presentation itself as well. But what we see as challenge of the hour, or for coming a couple of years, is that gender inequality is going to stay with us, which is very unfortunate reality of our times. And but there have been some positive changes, like there have been shifts in the discourse from women in development to gender and development approaches, and now we have reached a stage where there is more focus on working towards the causes of inequality rather than treating the symptoms of inequality. So that brings us to the gender transformative approaches, where the focus is on treating the causes of inequality with the structural factors, the gender norms that lead in unequal power relations and unequal roles among men and women, and within women of different ages or social strata. So the genesis of gender transformative approaches lies in health sector, specifically in sexual and reproductive health, if I talk of. But they are increasingly being used in agriculture and rural development sector. And the aquatic agriculture system has been the pioneer for this particular approach, if we talk particularly in terms of agriculture. And to our knowledge, this is the first systematic review on gender transformative approaches in agriculture. There are certain reviews on aquaculture interventions, but to our knowledge, this is probably the first systematic review on gender transformative approaches in agriculture, and thus aims to fill the gap in this field of knowledge. So the main objective of the review was, like, it's a mixed methods review. Like, we are trying to understand this area from the perspective of what interventions they work, why they work or they don't work, and how they work. So the focus is on getting to know the effectiveness of the interventions, as well as understanding why or why not they work, plus the mechanisms through which they work. So this brings me to the research questions of this systematic review. So we had for this systematic review, which had these research questions spelled out. So we wanted to understand what are the various components of interventions with gender transformative approaches in agriculture. And as I mentioned, what works or doesn't work, why it doesn't work, and how it works at various levels or in different contexts. This is just a crux of this thing. So you might probably would like to refer to the protocol if you're interested in reading more about this systematic review. So as regards the PCOs, we had men and women engaged in agriculture in low and middle income countries as the main population of interest. But we also were interested in finding studies where the program staff or community level influencers or other members of producer organizations or village savings and loan associations were the main population, or were the other, stakeholders involved in the process. The interventions, as is very clear from the name, was any intervention with gender transformative components. That is the interventions that might be aimed at transforming gender norms or gender roles at any level, be it micro, meso, or macro. Like those of you who might be familiar with this socio-ecological approach, so going from micro, meso, and macro levels. And this could be in combination with other interventions, because the understanding from the scoping of the literature was that these kind of interventions are generally embedded with some other interventions, which could be of various natures. I would just talk about them shortly. And then we also identified certain characteristics of gender transformative interventions, such as like they could be participatory in nature, but one characteristic feature that was really useful for us to identify studies was where they were focusing on involving men along with the women. So that was a kind of main, identifying characteristic for us while we were screening those studies. So since this systematic review includes studies from for both effectiveness and implementation components, we included studies with experimental, quasi-experimental, counterfactual, as well as factual designs. And accordingly, for the effectiveness studies, we had to have a valid comparison group, but this was not the case for the implementation studies. And the outcomes that we were primarily interested were women's empowerment outcomes, but there could be agriculture and livelihood outcomes, socio-cultural or nutritional outcomes. So these were the other outcomes that were there for the PICOs, or the framework for this map, for this systematic review, sorry. So this theory of change. So I would not spend much time on, as I mentioned earlier, so the protocol is already published. So if anyone is interested, they might probably refer to this in the protocol in the Campbell. It shows the hue of the population, and given certain contextual household, community, or macro level, under those circumstances, these interventions, when given, they undergo these pathways. These are the intermediate outcomes, and they might lead to or not lead to these specific intermediate outcomes. And then in those indicators, I'll talk about them again in some of the next slides. And finally, the transformation of gender norms might happen. So time on the method, but I state here that we used a very comprehensive search strategy comprising of the conventional database searches, which were like the prime databases in agricultural and food systems research, gray literature, website searches, hand searches of journals, citation tracking, and the conventional stages of the systematic review were followed: screening a title and abstract, full text screening done by 2 people, data was extracted by 2 people, then reconciled at the end, the critical appraisal was done, and finally the effect size extraction and meta-analysis of the studies were categorized into quantitative and qualitative, and then the data extraction of quantitative and studies were also done. So coming to the findings, flow chart. So we included 6,047 studies from the database searches, 682 from other searches. Overall, going through all the stages of the systematic review, we identified 39 studies. Some of them were the same versions of a specific study. So after linking up the records, we found 30 studies, of which 17 were qualitative and 13 were effectiveness of mixed method studies. If I talk of the region-wise distribution, you can see that the sub-Saharan Africa region had the highest number of studies, along with Latin America and Caribbean having only 4 studies. East Asia and Pacific had only 1 study, while the South Asia had 2 studies in this systematic review. So this shows you a broad over distribution of studies as per the countries, and these are the numbers, with Malawi having the highest number of studies. We had 1 study each from Cuba, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Bolivia, Honduras, Colombia, Myanmar, Ivory Coast, and 2 studies each from Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, Ghana, 4 each from Ethiopia, Zambia, and Uganda. If we talk of the scale of intervention, you can see that close to or more than 75% studies were conducted at the local level. 6 studies were conducted at the subnational level, and only 1 study was conducted at the national level. So talking of the various intervention categories, so as I told you earlier, so social behavioral change communication, they could be embedded with any other intervention, be it capacity building interventions or economic interventions. And primarily for this review, we had mostly asset transfer interventions with which they were coupled. And then this is the distribution of the categories, the subcategories rather. So you can see that this is something interesting to note, that the mostly gender dialogues or the were there prominently appearing as the social behavioral change communication intervention category, along with communication tools or curriculum, which could be theater of change, dramas, such kind of things. And the household level interventions, such as like one example would be the gender action learning system of such an approach or methodology. So these approaches were used in these interventions. And we had only 1 study where they made use of community radio or mid-media like posters or brochures, etc. So as I mentioned, we were primarily interested in the women empowerment outcome categories, but along with that, we had several other categories, nutrition and health outcome categories, and certain social psychological outcome categories. So this slide shows you the frequency of those outcome categories. So what we actually did was that we classified our women's empowerment outcome categories based on prominent or the prevalent sort of iterations of the VI, Women's Empowerment Agricultural Index, which are 3 domains of empowerment or the 5 domains of empowerment. In the review, we have used, in the draft stage, we have classified our data into both the 3 domains of empowerment and the 5. But here I'm only using the 3 domains of empowerment to reflect those findings. So these 3 domains of empowerment are intrinsic agency, instrumental agency, and collective agency. So taking that as the base, we added or customized this and added a few other outcome categories that were found in the included studies. And this was the outcome framework. And we find that instrumental agency outcomes were prominently studies, and as you can imagine, this is not an inclusive category. Like studies could have intrinsic as well as instrumental agency. So these numbers are not individual studies as such. So this is the outcome categorization. So the intrinsic agency subclassification categories. Instrumental agency had input in productive decisions, ownership of land and other assets, control over use of income, collective agency, and other indicators that I told you were also added to these particular categories. We talk the what worked. So these are some of the forest plots for individual outcome categories. So as you can see that intrinsic agency, like the interventions don't seem to work for the intrinsic agency outcomes, because if you see the overall effect, it is negative. But for the instrumental agency, the effect is positive, though not statistically significant. There are only 2 studies which measured the collective agency outcomes, and for those studies, one of them didn't show any effect, while the other had multidimensional agency. We had studies which with insignificant effects, and there were only 1 study each for the social and psychological agency and had a positive effect. The nutrition and health outcome study, again, we had only 1 study for this particular outcome, and it showed a negative effect. So this is the overall overview of meta-analysis. Like we have taken the overall outcome domains, and it shows, as I told you earlier, that intrinsic agency outcomes, it didn't have positive effect. Instrumental and collective had. and the as nutritional health outcomes and social and multidimensional who had only one study each, and social psychological agency also had a positive effect. Now coming to the why or why not GTAs worked. So as some of you might be knowing that the same factors as facilitators or as well as barrier in studies. So the some of the aspects coming from the design itself, they were reported as the facilitators, like the partnership and the local ownership, that these interventions basically sort of give people the that kind of spaces where they can think about and reflect about the issues that might be of interest to them. They come up with alternatives, they think of the solutions. Then since these activities typically follow a participatory approach, the facilitators not necessarily bring their agenda to the table, so they encourage people to think about the regressive gender norms and the problems that might be relevant for their context. So group facilitation skills and active learning was very important because the facilitators kept note of the entire process, observed the process very keenly from the end, and that would be very useful for revising or refining the activities probably. And the bottom up approach and visual tools, for example, for the communities where there isn't much literacy, that was very important, and they were reported as indicators. So barriers to participation are mostly on account of women's division of labor, which resulted in lack of time to engage in these activities. Spousal resistance, again influenced by the socio-cultural norms. The socio status whereby people couldn't afford to engage in these activities, even if the activities were meant for a couple, for a husband and wife from the family or the household, but either of them could engage because otherwise they would not be able to survive. Social cultural norms, like these are the barriers that run through the things, and that is why we are undertaking those gender transformative interventions or approaches. And finally, the unequal relations, not only between men and women, but also within women of different age groups or intergenerational hierarchies. So for example, women of older ages, they were not very receptive of the changes observing at the community, as men taking up some of the roles that were earlier taken by women. So some of the implementation challenges were, I told you earlier, that appears as a facilitator can also turn up as a challenge. So the participants also posed some challenge because they were because it kind of gives the power to the people, of course, in the community, but again, those with more the agenda, and then they might not actually be taking the issues that might be of interest to certain lower. And also simplistic understanding of transformation among the staff. For example, there was a citation in the study where there was a rather narrative in the study where the facilitators thought that if there was slight change in the gender division of labor at the staff was very enthusiastic about it, and they thought that they've been successful in changing or transforming the gender norms. I mean, which is a good thing, a good beginning, but there is a long way ahead. Then agencies, resource constraints, and intersectionality also pose challenges. We might dwell on these if the time permits. And finally, how these so these are the intervention basically interventions, the gender dialogues, gender transformative communication tools. They are working through the critical consciousness, raising critical consciousness among the community, enhancing intra-household cooperation, building the capacity or strengthening the capacity of the people or the households in the community, and even transferring assets or economic opportunities, of course, along with.
Could you wrap up in 1 minute?
Sure. I'm just going to. And again, we identified three of factors which could either act as barriers or facilitators, which would result in those intermediate outcomes, and finally the impact. So we might talk about later. And finally, solutions. So as you saw, most evidences from sub-Saharan Africa and is of mostly of low confidence in reporting of findings. The GTAs mostly have been implemented at local scale, and attitudinal tips are just the tip of the iceberg. And there are, like, as long as at the level of ownership uh, asset ownerships or land ownership. These are a very minuscule changes in the system. And of course, the transformation of norms is a time and resource intensive process. So the funding agencies and implementing agencies might like to consider that, these are not the quick fix things that you go to community, engage them in a few conversations, and overnight everything will change. So these things take time. And as you saw, quantitative findings, they suggest instrumental and collective agency outcomes, they are improved. Qualitative data supports that finding as well, but says that these changes are at the level of household where increased cooperation is observed among the household members. But as rights or major asset ownership, it still remains with men. And finally, just a sort of, kind of concluding line is that the components, they shouldn't be seen as an add and stir phenomena. The root cause of gender inequalities that need to be tackled well, along with treating the symptoms of inequality. The last line is actually a personal opinion, because all other interventions that are going on in the society, they won't cease to exist, but we must work towards eliminating the causes of gender inequalities. And thank you for your attention, and look forward to hearing any feedback or questions from you. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Sabina. It's a very interesting presentation. I don't see any question in the live Q&A section. I do have a few, but let's take the questions towards the end once Suchi has a chance to present the work. Suchi, so over to you.
Thank you. Just give me 1 minute. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I will be presenting the evidence on gender equality and women empowerment in agriculture and food system in low middle income countries. I will be presenting preliminary finding from one of my review, which is on value chain interventions for improving women's economic empowerment. It was a mixed method systematic review and meta-analysis. Uh, First of all, I really want to acknowledge the funder of CGI Gender Platform and the authors, which me, Swati, Neha, Ratika, Raf, Hamidia, Howard, Ranjita, Hugh, and then Eduardo. So basically, what we understand, like agriculture value chain intervention, we had discussed about a lot of things, but then agriculture value chains are actually influenced by social culture norms and gender dynamics that have an impact on the distribution of resources, benefits, and access to opportunities. We see women play a very critical role in agriculture. They are involved into farmings, but then it's like when you see the value chain intervention, they are very confined to very least valued parts, and the parts they are actually like involved into is like with the lowest economic returns, depending on the local and social and institutional context to it. When we planned this value chain intervention, what was the main objective of this review was to understand, evaluate what approaches, strategies, or intervention focused on women's engagement in agriculture value chains and markets that have led to women's economic empowerment in low and middle income countries. We also want to examine in what context are these approaches effective or ineffective. It's a mixed method review, so we also want to identify the contextual barriers and facilitator, determining the participation of women in and benefit from engagement in the value chain. One more objective is like we have to refine the theory of change that describes how value chain intervention leads to women's economic empowerment using evidence drawn from both rigorous quantitative impact evaluation and qualitative. Let's talk about the peak of this one. It's like the same. It's like it's women of all ages from low and middle income countries are engaged in agriculture, food system, and are targeted by value chain development and market engagement intervention. When we say that there is also subgroups like smallholder farmers, value chain entrepreneurs, or employees in the agri-business sector. In terms of intervention, we really want to see the vertical coordination, horizontal coordination, and upgrading and others. By vertical, we mean want to see like contract farming. Is there any public-private partnerships happen with horizontal, like promotion of farmer-based organization, corporations, like if product quality upgrading or small medium enterprises upgrading, any post-harvest management, inclusive market system development, infrastructure development, or any on-farm processing. Okay, so what was the outcome that we really want to see? Like, it's the outcome that we want to see is economic empowerment, because in value chain we are very really want to see only the economic empowerment. And then like decision making on value chain, or the use of income, bargaining power, any leaders position in groups, mobility, economic benefits, and participation. It's a mixed method review, so we have experimental, non-experimental effectiveness studies, process evaluation, and qualitative studies of intervention. When I talk about what, because value chain intervention, we got very good number of records when we actually identify the number of from our database searches. We follow the same rules, like same methodology, which is a standardized methodology. We search on databases. We also search on gray literature. We also use AP machine learning. We got more than 13,000 records, and then from databases we got around 12,000 records, and then there were like some benchmarking studies. Because there were a lot of paper which is very much relevant to value chain, we got very good number of studies which we included for full text screening. Because and then a lot of studies which are like 3,000 studies we included for full text screening, 3,831 studies, because there were a lot of evidence available on value chain interventions. But when we actually read about the studies, it's not about very specific on value chain intervention. It's and also on based on methodology we excluded most of the studies. And second is like for interventions. So the final number of studies that we actually included in value chain was mixed method studies, which is like 4, effectiveness 59, and process evaluation. So that's what I said, like number of studies, we got very good number of studies in like in terms of effectiveness, 59 studies, 55 process and mixed method studies. But effectiveness studies in like 59, they were like very hardly like only 4 studies are RCT, other were like quasi experimental studies. When we said the gender representation of the included studies, so in this thing what happened is like when we see that intervention is very much targeted to females, or it's like it's not targeted. So we saw that like interventions are not very much targeted. It's like it's given to smallholder farmers. Like 65% of the intervention is actually targeted to both the population, man and woman, involved into agriculture, into value chain development. And there were only 35% of the studies where we get the intervention is very much targeted to female. When we see the region-wise representation, I think so in gender transformative, and like my colleagues also said that we got most of representation from sub-Saharan Africa. Same with the value chain. Like there were like 67 studies from sub-Saharan Africa, and then we got 35 studies from South Asia, and then others like Latin America 10 studies, East Asia Pacific 6 studies. And South America three studies, but then majority of them is like representation is from sub-Saharan Africa. When we saw the intervention categories and subcategories, so what we basically found is horizontal and vertical integration. And horizontal and vertical coordination, we got 51 studies. But yes, because it's a preliminary findings, we will actually break down in our like in a final finding what exactly, how much is from the horizontal coordination, how much is from vertical coordination. But among this 51, majority of them is like basically formation of self-help groups and women's. And when we go about the value chain upgradation, there were a lot of process product chain upgrading, fair trade, organic farming. There were a lot of studies which is like which has this kind of intervention, fair trade. So let's talk about the quantitative analysis of it. So this was a finding by the meta-analysis, which is of overall what is we found from excess in knowledge, inputs, market outcomes, economic outcome, time use, and women's economic empowerment. There was like a medium size effects that we see in market outcomes and economic outcomes, and they were like not statistically significant outcome. We can see it's favoring the intervention except the time use, but it's not only the economic outcome has a medium size effects and empowerment, women's empowerment. Other than that, it's like it's not a very statistically significant effects. We say no beneficial effect of time use. Time use in value chain, we say it's like a burden. Like they were already have a gender, like they're already engaged into a lot of other activities, and for them engaging into value chain is like they don't get leisure activities, time for leisure activities. So it's like the value chain intervention does not have any effects on time use outcomes. And if you see, there's a substantial estimated heterogeneity in some of the outcomes. When I really specifically focusing on one of my outcome and see what's the sub outcome saying, when I say about women's economic empowerment, when you see in terms of decision making, in terms of empowerment, leadership, mobility, participation, it's saying that yeah, it is favoring but not statistically significant. But leadership is one where you get the moderate or positive effects on women's leadership. And it's because if you see, the representation is most from the formation of from the horizontal coordination, like the formation of self-help groups and formation of women's cooperatives. So leadership position, women's getting a leadership position is like one of the one of the things that we found. But then the number of studies are very less. We got a lot of studies which is talking about the decisions and then the participation, but leadership is like we see there's a moderate positive effects. So that's about the quantitative way, like we see that it's affecting. But when we see about the qualitative, there were some barriers and facilitators that's actually linked. If you see, it's actually talking about the same kind of thing, which is like which we also see from our quantitative findings, that the facilitator to participation is women's membership in associations. If you have been a member in association and you involved into associations, you actually start participating more. And then also, when I said in my previous slide, when it's quantitative, it's like leadership position, then you actually take a leadership position in the association. uh, so second is like even this out migration of men is also one of the thing, like interestingly found that it's one of the facilitator to participation. Because if women men's were migrated, women take the first seat and they were actually involved into activities, and they take a charge of economic activities. So that's how things happens, like when migration happen, out migration of men, then like women take that. Interestingly, we also found that poverty increased, more women were unable to move out of domestic spaces and then start seeking work, and they start working in the agriculture thing. But yeah, like they are starting working in agriculture, and they are starting involving into markets engagement, involving into value chains, different like starting membership, self-help groups. There was also some paper which actually said that there is an identification of gendered crops, which is actually termed as like women are more involved into such kind of terms. Like women's cooperatives have been made for kaswa coffees, groundnuts, and leafy greens. So they were like women's cooperative with such kind of thing, because they were like more involved into such kind of crops in value chain. We also find that there is like also willingness of women to be involved into value chain, and then also wants to for their own economic benefits. When they're part of this membership in SOGs and associations, they say that like if women are part, like other participants sharing their success stories, how they actually market their product, how their income is increased. It's actually success of other participants in Mexinity also involve more women engaged into value chain activities. When I said about the barriers, they were like there were a very existing barriers to overall. If you see about women subjects, yeah, women are like face a lot of barriers and then exploitation. But in terms of value chain, these are some which is very much highlighted, which is like stereotypes conditioned by social norms and culture. Women should not be engaged into farming. Women should not be get into market engagement. Like they were like saying that like she should only focusing on like household works, or she just only limited to the farm, like to the farm, not just being involved into discussing on fair trade or markets. So that's had one of the unavailability of women. Obviously women, because of the definite time use, like women are already very much demands of like household. There's already is a demand of labor. They also have engaged into some other household activities, child rearing. So like it's like they are not very much available for value chain activities, or for different value chain interventions. So there are like high levels of illiteracy among women, and that's why like when they were like knowledge and skill upgradation on organic farming, they're like it's illiteracy, and then market engagement involved understanding of how the certification happen on organic farming, how you get so they were like high level of illiteracy is one of the barriers that found. Unaided mobility is like it's a greater distance from cooperatives, markets, and centers. So it's actually also one of the barriers that woman does not participate in value chain. Men's are in leadership position in fair trade, in cooperatives, in markets. So that's also one of the barriers, like complex processes to access one's own land. So when it's saying the value chain, if you have an excess and a control in your resources, which is like one of his main your own land, that actually helps women more participating into value chain. But it's like it's a complex process to assess own's land. Like if it's If it's heritage, like then also you like getting it in your woman's name is also very complex. There's also state policies, political climate change, climate households, and religious ideologies. There were a lot of papers which talked about that religiously. It say that women's main responsibilities is to take care of husband and children. She should not be engaged. She should not be thinking about economic empowerment, economic income. That's her main responsibility. She should not walk out from that responsibility and go out and work. So that's also one of the things that barriers that found. When we say about the achieving outcomes, like what we found is like it's actually increase their knowledge and skills when they were involved. It's these are the facilitator which actually helps them to achieve the outcomes. So there were paper which say that the woman is saying that when I'm like sharing in the group meeting or village, it's actually exchange knowledge on organic agriculture with them, like so they it's actually increase their knowledge about organic agriculture, how to do it. And then the second, which I always like, institutionalize and formation of network of women such as women cooperatives, self-help groups, and women's association is the second most important facilitator to achieve the outcome, which is like women's economic empowerment and economic outcomes. So women's like it's just one of the quotes, but then women said this, like my husband used to manage everything. He said that he will buy everything, I should not be care about it, and then because I was part of it, then it's actually build my capacity, and now I can work and I can also earn. So if we said market, like one of the things that we said, like if women got a better market access and infrastructure support from market and better market linkages, this is one of the facilitators to achieve the outcome. And this is one of the example from one of the quote from one of the paper that we found is like there was a lady, she involved into lac production, and actually now she's earning a good amount from the production of it. And it actually helps her in improving her economic and then she also wants to like she plans to give up her below poverty line card also, and because now the highest earning lakh productor is now she earns more than that. So that's one of the thing, like if you get better market access and infrastructure, and then you being involved into value chain and you get a market linkages, then you can actually women can also like it's also improves their income plus productivity, plus it also leads to economic empowerment because they have a decision making power. And then they also have a leadership position, and that's how overall how this value chain actually helps if they have enough facilitator, which is like a market linkages. Land ownership, as I said, if the women control over assets such as land, women acquire their land, and it actually helps them. Obviously they can control what kind of production they want to do, decision making on marketing of that product. All this can be also like it's also one of the facilitator to achieve it. When I talked about the barriers to achieve the outcome, which is economic empowerment, economic.
Suchi, I'm sorry, could you wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes? We only have 6 minutes left. So.
Okay, so just like I will not say much, like so basically it's like it's exploitation by commission agent, lack of market information, decision making. They don't have land ownership. I talked about man in the leadership position, fair trade, and lack of control over resources, and increased workload of for women. So what was a key finding? As we said, like women's economic outcome is improved. We say that effects of the woman of women's mobility, decision making, targeted intervention are more effective on women empowerment than untargeted intervention. In our qualitative synthesis, we found that horizontal coordination, such as promoting cooperatives and other farmer-based organizations, is more effective in improving empowerment than intervention, which is only vertical coordination of contract farming or product upgradation like fair trade. I'm just concluding it. There is a lack of experimental evidence, and the majority of the available evidence is quasi-experimental. We also see that the impact of intervention is like because we have a majority of from like which is untargeted intervention. So like it's not male and female beneficiaries are not always reported and analyzed. Important economic empowerment outcome is like time use is rarely afforded, and evidence available is mostly concentrated on sub-Saharan Africa. This has actually we can't generalize it because it's more on sub-Saharan Africa. Now, thank you very much. I'm like, please ask any question that you have for.
Great, thank you so much, Suchi. A very interesting presentation. I think there's a question posed to you in terms of how people can access both of your publications. So you want to answer it? It's in the protocol status.
Yes. So basically, at this time, because for value chain, it's a preliminary finding, and then we only have a protocol stage. But yes, when it's published, we can like you can see in Valley Journal, like it will be published, and we will have this in our Campbell South Asia website as well.
Perfect. Great. See, we only have 4 minutes left, so and we don't have any questions in the live Q&A. So I would just like to, in one or two lines, let's conclude our presentations in terms of what are the key immediate finding that comes up. What is the implication for women farmers that comes out from the research? So maybe I'll start. So from the SR1 perspective, since we only included quantitative impact evaluation and we did not do the qualitative assessment, a key finding that came out that of course there's a lack of studies talking about the infrastructure or institutional arrangements across these studies. They were mainly around knowledge dissemination approaches, talking about individual level and individual knowledge and awareness, not talking about system level changes or not talking about any institutional or financial arrangements so that the barriers are removed in terms of accessing CSA practices. In terms of the implications for women farmers, I think it is imperative to involve women farmers in terms of research generation, mainly so that they have more access to the knowledge base and thereby they will have more access to the agricultural production as well as innovative technologies. So Sabina, could you also summarize your findings into 1 minute so that Suchi also has time?
Sure, thanks. So just to summarize, as you saw, we had evidence. So this area is still in a nascent kind of stage, and most of the evidence is coming from the sub-Saharan Africa region, and there is like a kind of total lack of evidence as per what we found. Happy if you have some more studies on gender transformative approaches, if you are aware of, you can share with us on our, I will probably drop my email ID, and I would be more than happy if you can share any studies that you're familiar or aware that have been conducted in any other region of the world. And in terms of implications of gender transformative approaches, I think the whole point is that the empowerment of women, not at the expense of disempowerment of men. So taking both men and women together as agents of change and partners in the process, and that would probably lead to a more inclusive society. And eventually, hopefully, we would be able to transform these gender norms, and that would be a kind of, some might sound very utopian, and given the progressive indicators that we see on an everyday basis, still looks like an utopian kind of thought. But still, I think it's good to work towards such issues. Every member of the society is gets an equal opportunity to access whatever life choices they might want to make. And lastly, the main challenge is bringing the discussion back to the point of women, is that the issue of intersectionality poses a major challenge in implementation of gender transformative approaches, because then there are stratas within the society that need to be taken care of. And
Yeah.
there, over to Suchi.
So,
Thanks.
okay, yeah, please, Suchi, summarize in 1 minute.
Okay,
Yeah.
so basically, when you say about the value chain intervention, it's like what we found is like value chain intervention has an effects on economic empowerment, but then it's like it's not, the interventions are not very much targeted to women. It's like actually given it to smallholder farmer. So when we intervention, any intervention which is very much targeted, that's where we still needs to explore. If intervention is too much targeted, like if we don't have evidence when intervention is actually targeting to women only, and then this leads to women's economic empowerment. We also found from our qualitative synthesis, and then like from the findings, like even though women's economic empowerment does not mean that it's actually leads to women's empowerment in families and decision making. It's very it's not very effective. It's like they are just only have some effects on economic outcomes, that income is increased, farming productivity is increased, but then it does not leads to moreover economic empowerment in decision making. That is one of the things which I said, like even though we are too much structured intervention given it to, then it's like it's more of thing. Lastly, I want to say, like as was said, like the evidence is more on sub-Saharan Africa. So obviously, it's important that we should get more evidence on value intervention from other parts, like developing countries, and then we can have this. Yeah,
So,
and then thank you from.
because we only have 30 seconds, I will just take this opportunity to thank the participant as well as our sponsors for WWGS 2022. I would request all the participants to kindly load your favorite presentation and poster through an email that you will get from Events Air. And also, please use this opportunity to visit the exhibition and poster hall to again assess your best poster presentation according to your perception. Again, thank you so much for patiently listening to us. Thank you to all the panelists, and we look forward to your questions. In case you have any, you can find us on Twitter, and we would be happy to, answer any of your questions there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.